The dog didn't bark. He didn't beg. He just stood in the storm and knocked. Inside the lonely cabin, Jack Miller, a retired Navy SEAL who hadn't found peace in years, stared at the rain-soaked door. The German shepherd outside was shaking, ribs showing, one wounded paw lifted against the wood as if he knew exactly who he was looking for. Jack didn't know the dog carried a dead marshal's final secret. He didn't know the old K9 tag around its neck could expose a truth buried for 3 years. He only knew one thing. No warrior should be left alone in a storm. But here's the question. Did the Navy SEAL rescue the dog, or did the dog come back to rescue the Navy SEAL? Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss more powerful stories of loyalty, faith, and second chances. Rain hammered Cedar Ridge, Tennessee, as if the mountains themselves were trying to wash old sins out of the dark. Thunder rolled over the Great Smokies, deep and slow, shaking the windows of Jack Miller's cabin. The weather radio on the kitchen counter crackled between bursts of static, its orange warning light blinking like a nervous eye. Tornado warning. Flash flood warning. Seek shelter immediately. Jack heard every word, but his face barely changed. He was 44 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the compact strength of a man who had spent half his life carrying weight no one could see. His dark hair was cut short in the old military habit, neat even when the rest of him looked tired. A hard, square jaw, pale blue-gray eyes, and a thin scar near his left cheek gave him the look of a man carved by weather and war rather than by kindness. He wore a faded gray t-shirt under a dark green field jacket, jeans worn white at the knees, and brown boots still muddy from the morning's work. Once, Jack had been a Navy SEAL, the kind of man who entered rooms before fear had time to introduce itself. Now he lived alone outside town, where the pine trees stood like silent judges and the nearest neighbor was far enough away not to ask questions. He was not afraid of thunder. Thunder was honest. It announced itself, split the sky, and moved on. What bothered Jack was the silence after it, that hollow pause when the whole world seemed to hold its breath. It reminded him of Afghanistan, of a moonless compound, of dust hanging in the air after an explosion, of Petty Officer Ben Carter lying half-hidden in the smoke. Ben had been 26, lean and freckled, with sandy red hair and a grin too bright for the places they had been sent. He had joked before every mission as if humor were body armor. Jack had been closest when Ben fell. 3 seconds. That was all. 3 seconds to measure distance, angles, gunfire, risk. 3 seconds to think like an operator instead of move like a brother. By the time Jack ran, the second shot had already written its sentence. Ben never came home. Jack did. Some nights, that felt less like survival and more like theft. Another blast of thunder struck so close the cabin lights flickered. Jack sat at the small wooden table with a cup of black coffee gone cold between his hands. The cabin was orderly, almost bare. One couch, one chair, one bed, one framed photograph turned slightly away from the room. No clutter, no warmth wasted, nothing that could be mistaken for a life rebuilt. Then came the knock. 3 soft taps. Jack lifted his head. At first, he thought it was a loose branch striking the porch. The storm had torn half the leaves from the old maple beside the driveway. He waited. SEAL training had never truly left him. It had only grown quieter, like a wolf sleeping under floorboards. He listened past the rain, past the radio static, past his own breathing. Tap, 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 not random, not wind. Jack stood slowly. His hand did not reach for a weapon, though instinct remembered where one would have been. He crossed the room, each step measured, and stopped beside the front door. Through the narrow window, lightning flashed white across the yard. For 1 sharp second, the porch appeared in brutal detail. A German shepherd stood there. The dog was large but terribly thin, perhaps 7 years old, with black and brown fur plastered to his body by rain and mud. His ribs showed beneath his soaked coat. One hind leg trembled, held slightly off the wooden boards as if pain had become an old companion. His ears were upright but not aggressive, his muzzle streaked with gray, his amber eyes steady and strangely human. He did not bark, he did not scratch. He simply placed one mud-caked paw against the door and looked at Jack as if he had crossed every mile of hell to find this exact porch. Jack opened the door. Wind and rain rushed in, cold as a warning. The shepherd did not charge inside, he did not collapse. He stood at the threshold, shivering hard but controlled. Jack had seen that kind of restraint before, not in pets, not in strays, in working dogs, in soldiers, in creatures trained to keep their fear on a leash. "Easy," Jack said, his voice low. The dog's eyes flicked once to his face. Not begging, assessing. Jack crouched slowly, careful not to crowd him. A flash of lightning lit the porch again, and something dull metal glinted beneath the dog's muddy neck fur. Jack reached gently, parting the wet hair. An old K9 tag hung from a torn collar, rusted around the edges, the letters scratched nearly away. He wiped it with his thumb. Ranger. Return to MW. Jack's chest tightened. A name, a mission, a ghost with 4 legs. He turned toward the counter, already thinking of animal control, a vet, anyone with a warm kennel and better answers than his empty cabin could offer. Then the radio screamed with a burst of emergency tone. Flash flood reported near Whitaker Farm. County bridge on Miller Creek has partially collapsed. Residents in low-lying areas should evacuate immediately. The shepherd's head snapped toward the dark tree line beyond the porch. His body changed. Pain vanished under purpose. His ears locked forward. A low sound rose from his chest. Not a growl, not a whimper, but something deeper, almost a plea shaped by discipline. He stepped back into the rain, then looked over his shoulder at Jack. The old silence after thunder returned, waiting for him. Jack stared at the dog, at the tag, at the storm swallowing the road toward Whitaker Farm. He understood then, with a certainty that felt less like thought than command. Ranger had not come to be rescued. He had come to lead him. Jack did not follow Ranger into the storm immediately. A younger version of him might have done it, charging into rain and darkness on instinct alone, letting guilt masquerade as courage. But age, war, and the long punishment of memory had taught him that rushing blind could bury more people than fear ever did. He opened the door wider, letting the rain lash across the threshold, then gave the German shepherd a quiet command. "Inside first." Ranger stood on the porch for one hard breath, torn between the storm behind him and the man in front of him. His lean body trembled so violently that water shook from the ends of his fur, yet his amber eyes stayed fixed toward the trees, toward the unseen road that led down to Miller Creek and Whitaker Farm. Then, as if some old training overruled pain, he stepped into the cabin. Mud spread beneath his paws in dark half-moons. Jack shut the door against the storm and felt the whole house go small and tense around them. The dog did not wander. He did not sniff the corners like a lost pet searching for comfort. He moved 3 steps inside, turned so he could see both Jack and the door, and stopped. That choice told Jack more than barking ever could. Ranger was not hiding from the weather. He was holding a position. Jack took a towel from a wooden shelf near the washer and crouched slowly, keeping his shoulders loose and his eyes calm. "Easy," he said. "Nobody's taking your post." Ranger watched every movement. He was a German shepherd of about 7 years, sable-coated beneath the mud, black along the back and shoulders, brown at the chest and legs, with early gray touching his muzzle like frost before winter. He should have been powerful, and maybe once he had been, but now hunger had sharpened him down to bone and stubborn spirit. His ribs rose under wet fur, his hips sat too high. One rear leg carried an old injury that made the muscle pull unevenly when he shifted weight. Yet there was still something royal in him, something ruined but not defeated, like a battle flag dragged through mud and somehow still lifted. Jack began wiping the rain from Ranger's neck and shoulders. The dog flinched once when the towel brushed the torn collar, but he did not snap. He merely tightened his jaw, endured it, and kept his gaze near the door. Beneath the collar, Jack found the first true warning. A ring of scar tissue almost hidden under thick fur, not fresh, not accidental. It had the look of long pressure, long restraint. Maybe a collar worn too tight for too long, or something worse. Jack's hand paused. Anger came quietly in him, the dangerous kind, not hot enough to spill, but deep enough to stay. "Someone tried to hold you," he murmured. Ranger's ears twitched, but he gave no other answer. Jack checked lower. The old wound in the hind leg had healed crooked, not enough to cripple him, but enough to make every mile a negotiation. His paws were cracked and rough, nails worn blunt from hard travel. There were burrs buried behind one ear, a thin scrape along his chest, and a small patch where fur had grown back unevenly near his shoulder. These were not the marks of a dog who had escaped a yard that afternoon. These were the marks of a long road, of ditches, culverts, fences, storms, and nights spent listening for footsteps. Jack stood and went to the kitchen. In the refrigerator, he found leftover chicken wrapped in foil, plain enough not to hurt an empty stomach. He tore it into small pieces and filled a bowl with water. When he set both on the floor, Ranger's nostrils flared. Hunger moved through him like a visible thing. His body leaned forward a fraction, then stopped. He looked at the food, then at Jack, not pleading, waiting. Jack felt his throat tighten. He knew this language, not because he had been a handler, but because he had worked near dogs like Ranger in places where darkness had teeth. Dogs that moved ahead of men into compounds. Dogs that froze at invisible scents. Dogs that knew the difference between permission and chaos. Ranger was starving, shaking, wounded, and still he would not break discipline. Jack lowered his voice. "Okay." Only then did Ranger move. He ate slowly at first, with painful control, then stopped halfway through to look at the door again. Jack almost laughed, but it came out as a breath with no humor in it. "You're worse than me," he said. "Can't even eat without checking the perimeter." Ranger drank, careful and measured, then stepped back from the bowl before it was empty. The storm rolled over the cabin, thunder dragging its iron belly across the hills. The radio on the counter crackled again, its warning lights still blinking. Jack turned it louder. A woman's recorded emergency voice cut through the static, reporting flash flooding near Miller Creek, a partial bridge collapse, and dangerous conditions around low-lying farms east of town. At the words Whitaker Farm, Ranger changed. It was instant. His head lifted, his ears locked forward. His injured leg trembled, but he ignored it, moving toward the door with a focus so sharp it seemed to pull the air behind him. Jack looked at the tag again. The letters Ranger had carried through rain and mud. Return to M.W. Iwu Whitaker. The connection was not proof, but it was enough to make the room feel colder. Jack crossed to the small desk by the window, where an old county map lay folded beneath a flashlight and a box of spare batteries. He spread it open with one hand. Miller Creek cut through the eastern ridge like a crooked vein. Whitaker Farm sat beyond it, boxed in by woods on one side and low pasture on the other. If the bridge was damaged and water was rising, anyone out there could be trapped by morning. Ranger pressed his nose near the crack under the front door and let out a low, broken sound. Not a bark, not a whine. A warning pulled from somewhere deeper than pain. Jack looked at him and felt the old wound inside himself shift, but this time it did not open backward into memory. It pointed forward. That was the difference. Ranger's discipline did not drag Jack back into the worst night of his life. It forced him to read the present. The dog had come in the storm wearing a name, a direction, and a plea. Jack grabbed his dark raincoat, slipped the flashlight into his pocket, and took his phone from the counter. He called the Cedar Ridge Sheriff's Office. The line clicked twice before Deputy Ryan Brooks answered, his voice roughened by a long shift and bad weather. Ryan was 35, broad-shouldered and solid through the chest, with close-cut brown hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and calm hazel eyes that made people feel he was listening even when he said very little. Around town he was known as fair but stubborn, The kind of deputy who would help an old woman carry groceries and then ticket her grandson for speeding 5 minutes later. Years earlier, he had lost his younger brother in a flood-swollen creek after a drunk driver forced the boy's truck off a county road. Since then, Ryan treated every storm warning like a personal enemy. "Miller," he said when he recognized the number. "Tell me you're inside." Jack looked at Ranger. The dog stood at the door now, body angled toward the storm, pain shaking in his back leg, duty holding everything else upright. "A K9 showed up at my cabin," Jack said. "German Shepherd. Tag says Ranger. Also says return to MW. He reacted when the radio mentioned Whitaker Farm." Ryan went silent for a beat. Jack could hear voices in the background, dispatch chatter, rain hitting some window on the other end. "Mary Whitaker's place?" Ryan asked. "That's what I'm thinking. Jack, listen to me. Miller Creek's rising fast. We've got roads washing out, and I don't have a unit close enough to get there clean. Do not go out there by yourself." Ranger turned his head and looked at Jack. In those amber eyes there was no panic, no confusion, only the terrible patience of a creature who had already waited too long. Jack opened the door. Rain burst into the cabin like a living thing. Ranger stepped onto the porch before Jack gave the order. He did not run. He waited at the top stair, checking once over his shoulder. Jack followed with the flashlight in his hand and the phone still at his ear. "Ryan," he said quietly, "if someone's trapped out there, I'm not waiting until morning." The truck pushed into the storm like a stubborn animal, headlights cutting only a few yards through the rain before darkness swallowed the road again. Jack Miller drove with both hands on the wheel, shoulders still, jaw set, his eyes moving between the cracked mountain road, the rising water in the ditches, and Ranger in the passenger seat. The old German Shepherd sat upright despite the tremor in his injured hind leg, his soaked body wrapped in one of Jack's wool blankets, his nose pointed toward the windshield as if the storm carried a language only he could read. Every time the truck neared a bend in the road, Ranger's ears shifted before Jack saw the turn. Every time thunder broke over the ridge, the dog did not flinch. He only leaned forward, more certain, more urgent. Rain struck the windshield so hard it sounded like gravel thrown by an angry hand. The wipers fought and lost, smearing silver sheets across the glass. Jack kept the truck slow, but not timid. The road to Whitaker Farm curled through low woods and old pasture land, dipping twice toward Miller Creek before climbing again. In daylight it would have looked gentle, maybe even pretty. Tonight it looked like a thing waiting to take something. Water rushed across the asphalt in thin brown streams. Branches lay twisted near the shoulder. Once Jack had to brake hard when a fallen limb appeared out of the dark, thick as a man's leg and slick with leaves. Ranger stood halfway from the seat before the truck stopped, not panicked, simply ready. "Sit," Jack said. Ranger obeyed, but his eyes stayed on the road. Jack almost told him they would get there. The words rose and died. He had learned long ago that promises made in storms were either sacred or foolish, and a man had better know the difference before speaking them. His phone buzzed once in the cup holder, Ryan's name flashing on the screen. Jack answered on speaker without slowing. "Where are you?" Deputy Ryan Brooks asked, his voice breaking under static. "Half a mile from the Whitaker turnoff," Jack said. "Road's bad, but passable. Backup is delayed. South Bridge is gone, North Road's flooded. I'm trying to come in from County 9, but it'll take time." Jack glanced at Ranger. The dog had gone rigid. Ahead, beyond the next bend, a weather-beaten wooden sign swung wildly on two rusted chains. Whitaker Farm. The letters were faded white, almost ghostly in the headlights. "I'm at the turn," Jack said. Ryan swore softly, not at Jack, but at the night. "Do not enter any unstable structure unless you have to." Jack looked through the rain. Beyond the sign, a narrow gravel lane disappeared between black trees. "That's usually how it works," he said, and ended the call before Ryan could argue. The gravel lane was worse than the road. The truck bounced through ruts filled with muddy water, its tires sliding once near a ditch before catching again. Ranger gave one low bark. The first sound Jack had heard from him that was not a warning breath or a broken whine. It was sharp, controlled, and full of command. At the end of the lane, Whitaker Farm emerged through rain and lightning, an old white farmhouse with a sagging porch, green shutters, and a tin roof beaten dull by decades of Tennessee weather. It sat beneath the hill like a widow, with her back bent but not broken. A single lamp glowed in an upstairs window. Behind the house, past a fenced paddock half drowned in runoff, stood a horse barn. One side of its roof had collapsed inward. A wall leaned at a cruel angle. Floodwater rushed around the foundation, carrying straw, broken boards, and pieces of feed sacks into the dark. Ranger exploded into motion before Jack fully stopped the truck. He pawed at the door handle, teeth bared not in aggression but urgency. Jack threw the truck into park, grabbed the flashlight, and opened the passenger door. Ranger leaped down badly, his injured leg buckling for half a second, but he recovered and ran toward the barn with a sound that split the rain. This time he barked again and again, each cry raw enough to wake the dead. "Ranger!" Jack shouted, but the dog did not slow. Jack followed, boots sinking into mud. The water around the barn was already over his ankles and rising fast. The smell hit him first. Wet hay, manure, splintered pine, and something metallic beneath it, like old tools left in rain. Then he heard a voice. Faint, elderly, female. "Help! Lord, please!" Jack's flashlight found the gap where two barn doors had jammed together under a fallen beam. Inside, beyond the cracked boards, an older woman lay trapped near a stall gate, one leg pinned beneath a section of broken rail. Water swirled around her boots and climbed toward her calves. She was small and thin, perhaps 72, with silver-white hair undone from a braid and plastered to her cheeks, pale skin lined by years of grief and sun, and blue eyes that had not surrendered even though her body looked close to it. She wore a faded yellow raincoat over a nightgown and one rubber boot. The other foot was bare, scraped, and bleeding. This was Mary Whitaker. Even before she gave her name, Jack knew it. The house, the initials, the way Ranger threw himself against the barn door as if the whole world depended on reaching her. "Ma'am, I'm Jack Miller," he called. "I'm getting you out." Mary turned her face toward the flashlight, blinking through rain and dust. "Who's there with you?" she asked, her voice shaking. Ranger forced his head through the gap in the broken door and barked. Mary froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound came at first. The storm seemed to pause around that single breath. "Ranger?" she whispered. The dog clawed at the boards. Jack shoved his shoulder against the door. It did not move. He stepped back, scanned the frame, and saw the problem. The crossbeam had dropped just enough to wedge the doors shut. He wedged the flashlight under his arm, gripped a broken length of rail, and used it as a lever. The wood groaned. Ranger barked from beside him, furious at time itself. "Easy," Jack said through clenched teeth, though he was not sure whether he was speaking to the dog, the woman, or the storm. The beam shifted an inch, then another. Jack drove his shoulder into the door again. Pain flashed down his arm, hot and clean. The old wood cracked open wide enough for him to slip through sideways. Ranger squeezed in after him, ignoring the jagged edge that scraped his flank. Mary reached toward him with both trembling hands. "Oh, my sweet boy," she cried. Ranger lowered his head into her palms, and the old warrior became, for one breath, someone's lost child. Jack moved fast. "Mary, I need to lift this rail off your leg. You know my name?" The dog told me enough. A laugh broke out of her, frightened and disbelieving, then turned into a gasp as thunder shook the barn. Jack braced his boots, lifted the broken rail, and saw her foot twisted at an ugly angle but not crushed. "When I lift, you pull back." "I can try." "No," Jack said, steady and firm. "You will." Mary looked at him then, really looked, and something in his voice gave her a handhold. He lifted. She dragged herself backward with a cry. Ranger pressed close to her shoulder, not in the way, but near enough for her to clutch his wet fur. Above them, a heavy crack snapped through the barn rafters. Jack looked up. A section of roof sagged, water pouring through like a black curtain. "We move now." He got one arm behind Mary's back and the other beneath her knees. She was lighter than he expected, bird-boned but stubborn, her hands gripping his jacket with surprising strength. Ranger turned toward the broken doors and led them out, barking once as another beam gave way behind them. Jack cleared the threshold just as a slab of roofing collapsed into the stall where Mary had been trapped. Muddy water burst outward, soaking his legs. He carried her through the flooded yard to the truck, Ranger limping beside them, his body shaking from pain and victory. Jack set Mary in the back seat and wrapped the dry emergency blanket around her shoulders. Her face was wet with rain and tears, but her eyes never left the dog. Ranger put his front paws on the truck floor and rested his head on her lap. Mary touched the torn collar, then the rusted tag. "Luke said he would," she whispered. Jack stood in the open door, rain running down his face. "Luke?" Mary swallowed, stroking Ranger's muddy head with both hands. "My son, Deputy Marshal Luke Whitaker. Ranger was his K-9. Everyone said they both died 3 years ago in the explosion at Carl Mercer's old warehouse." Her voice broke on the name. Carl Mercer was known in Cedar Ridge as a wealthy contractor with clean boots, silver hair, and a smile too polished for an honest man. A man who bought land from the desperate and called it opportunity. Mary looked down at Ranger as if heaven had returned a piece of her child in fur and bone. "But Luke told me once," she said, clutching the tag, "if anything ever happened, Ranger would know the way home." Morning came to Cedar Ridge without sunlight. The storm had moved east, but it left the town bruised beneath a low gray sky, with broken branches across the roads, muddy water crawling through ditches, and the mountains steaming like tired beasts after battle. Jack Miller drove through it all in silence, his old pickup rattling over washed-out gravel, while Ranger lay on a blanket across the passenger seat with his head lifted just enough to watch the road. The German shepherd had slept less than an hour after the rescue at Whitaker Farm. Even with exhaustion dragging at his bones, he had refused to settle anywhere he could not see the door, Mary Whitaker and Jack, at the same time. Mary had been taken to the county medical center before dawn with a sprained ankle, bruised ribs, and a stubborn refusal to stop asking about the dog. Before the ambulance doors closed, the frail old woman had gripped Jack's wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "Don't let him disappear again." Jack had promised only with a nod because spoken promises still felt dangerous to him, but the weight of it rode beside him now in the shape of a wounded K-9 with muddy fur and a rusted tag. Ranger's collar rested loose against his neck, the old metal plate tapping softly whenever the truck hit a rut. Ranger. Return to MW. The letters seemed less like identification now and more like scripture, a command carried through 3 lost years. Jack had called Deputy Ryan Brooks before leaving Mary's farm, and Ryan had told him to take Ranger to Sarah Collins first. "If that dog really belonged to Luke Whitaker," Ryan had said, his voice low and careful, "Sarah will know where to start." Collins' veterinary clinic sat near the edge of town in a converted brick feed store with a green metal roof and a hand-painted sign shaped like a paw print. The parking lot was half mud, half gravel, and a row of wet dogwood trees leaned over the fence like old women trying to hear gossip. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic, hay, and coffee that had been reheated too many times. Dr. Sarah Collins came out from the back room wiping her hands on a blue towel. She was 38, tall and lean, with auburn hair tied in a loose braid down her back, fair skin freckled across the nose, and green eyes sharp enough to notice pain before people admitted it. She had the steady hands of someone used to stitching wounds while frightened animals trembled beneath her palms, but there was warmth in her face, a patient kindness that did not feel soft or foolish. Her father had been a sheriff's deputy in the next county, a quiet man killed by a drunk driver when Sarah was 16, and since then she had carried a private distrust of preventable cruelty. She did not like people who hurt what depended on them. When Jack opened the passenger door, Ranger did not jump down. He looked at Sarah first, measuring her. Sarah stopped several feet away and lowered her voice. "Well," she said, "you came back from the dead, didn't you?" Jack turned toward her. "You know him?" Sarah's expression tightened, not with fear, but with recognition that hurt. "I knew of him. Everybody who knew Luke knew about Ranger." She crouched slowly, offering the back of her hand without forcing it into the dog's space. Ranger sniffed once, then allowed her closer. "Luke Whitaker brought him here twice," she said. "Once for a cut paw, once after Ranger swallowed half a tennis ball during a training day and scared 10 years off Luke's life. For a second, a ghost of a smile touched her mouth. Then she saw the collar, the ribs, the old leg injury, and the smile vanished. "Bring him in." Ranger walked beside Jack into the exam room, limping but proud, refusing help with a stubbornness that almost made Sarah mutter under her breath. She lifted him onto the padded table with Jack's assistance, then began a careful examination. She found dehydration, old scar tissue, muscle loss, healed fractures in the hind leg, and skin irritation beneath the collar. But when she passed a microchip scanner between Ranger's shoulder blades, the device beeped with a small electronic sound that changed the air in the room. Sarah read the number on the screen, then typed it into her clinic database. Her face went still. "Registered working K9, she said. "Ranger, attached to Deputy Marshal Luke Whitaker during a joint investigation with federal authorities." Jack stood beside the table, one hand resting near Ranger's shoulder. "Investigation into Carl Mercer?" Sarah looked up. "Mary told you." "Enough." Sarah turned the monitor slightly. Carl Mercer was never just a contractor. Not officially, anyway. There were suspicions he was moving illegal blasting materials through shell companies, buying up elderly people's land under pressure, and clearing parcels for a resort project before anyone approved it. Luke was helping the marshals track the money and the materials. Then the warehouse exploded. Luke died. Ranger was listed missing and presumed dead. Carl walked away claiming the whole thing was an industrial accident. Her voice had sharpened around Carl's name. In Cedar Ridge, Carl Mercer wore expensive boots and donated to church roof repairs, but Sarah said his name like it tasted of rust. Jack looked down at Ranger. The dog's eyes were open, fixed not on the room, but on Sarah's hands as she touched the collar. "This lining is wrong," Sarah murmured. She parted the torn leather with her thumbs. "Someone stitched this after the collar was made." Jack leaned closer. Inside the old collar, hidden beneath a layer of cracked padding, was a small, sealed plastic sleeve, dark with age and mud at the edges. Sarah used surgical scissors to open the seam carefully. From the sleeve, she removed a tiny waterproof USB drive, scratched and cloudy, no bigger than a man's thumbnail. Written across its side in fading black marker were words that made Jack's chest go cold. "If I don't make it, follow Ranger." Sarah stopped breathing for a moment. Jack did not touch it right away. Ranger lifted his head, ears rising, as if he knew that the room had finally found what he had been carrying. 3 years. Through hunger, injury, weather, and whatever hands had tried to hold him, the dog had carried a dead man's last instruction beneath his collar. Sarah slipped the drive into a small evidence bag. "We need Ryan," she said. Jack nodded. "And a computer that won't destroy whatever's on it." Sarah gave him a look that was almost offended. "I'm a vet in a mountain town, Jack, not a raccoon with a stethoscope. I have one." She carried the drive toward her office, but before they reached the hallway, Ranger gave a low growl. It was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was controlled, deep, and certain. Jack turned toward the front window. A dark silver SUV sat across the street, engine running, windows tinted despite the gray morning. Beside the reception desk stood a man Jack had not noticed enter. He was in his late 30s, narrow-faced, with pale skin, a patchy brown beard, and a cheap black rain jacket that still had the fold lines of something bought in a hurry. His smile came too quickly and reached nowhere near his eyes. "Morning," the man said, glancing at Ranger, then at the collar in Sarah's hand. "Heard somebody brought in a shepherd. I'm looking to buy one for my property." Sarah's face cooled. "This isn't a pet shop." Just asking. The man lifted both hands, but his right thumb moved against the side of his phone. A tiny camera lens caught the light. Jack stepped between him and Ranger. The man's eyes flicked to Jack's shoulders, then to his scar, then to the door. "No harm meant." "Then leave," Jack said. The man obeyed too fast. He walked out into the wet morning, climbed into the silver SUV, and the vehicle pulled away without headlights. Sarah locked the clinic door behind him. Her hand was steady, but her face had gone pale. "That was Dale Hobbs," she said. "He does odd jobs for Carl Mercer." Ranger's growl faded, but his body remained rigid. Jack looked from the evidence bag to the empty street where the SUV had been. The storm had ended, but something darker had begun moving beneath the mud. Ranger had not only come home. Someone had just learned he was alive. By the time Deputy Ryan Brooks arrived at Sarah Collins's clinic, the gray morning had turned black again, as if the storm had gone only far enough to gather more anger. Rain crawled down the front windows in crooked streams, and Ranger stood near the locked door with his head low, ears forward, and one paw slightly raised, listening to the road outside as though every passing tire might carry an enemy. Ryan entered with wet shoulders, mud on his boots, and doubt written plainly across his face. He respected Jack Miller, but respect was not the same as permission. To Ryan, a wounded dog, a rusted collar, and an old tragedy were not enough to reopen a case that had been buried under reports, politics, and 3 years of silence. "You understand how this looks," Ryan said, his hazel eyes moving from Jack to Sarah, then to the small waterproof USB sealed in a clear evidence bag on her desk. "A dead Marshal's K9 shows up in a flood, carrying a secret drive in his collar, and now we're saying Carl Mercer covered up a murder?" Sarah, still wearing her blue clinic coat over jeans and muddy boots, did not flinch. Her auburn braid had loosened, strands of hair sticking to her freckled cheeks, but her hand stayed calm as she connected the drive to an old offline laptop she kept for medical records. "No," she said. "We're saying Luke Whitaker hid something because he knew no one would believe him in time. The first 2 files were corrupted. The third opened halfway, freezing twice before a shaky video appeared. Luke Whitaker filled the screen, younger than Jack expected, 31 or 32, with dark blonde hair cut close, a lean face, and tired blue eyes that looked too much like Mary's. He wore a field jacket over a marshal vest, and mud streaked one side of his jaw. Behind him, barely visible in the dim light, stood stacks of wooden crates marked as construction supplies. Luke's voice cracked through the damaged audio. "If this is found, Carl Mercer is moving blasting caps and restricted materials through the Miller Creek warehouse. He's pressuring my mother to sell Whitaker Farm because the old access road cuts across what he wants for the resort project. I don't have enough to make it stick yet. Ranger has the scent. If I don't make it, follow Ranger. The rest is under the floor." The video jumped, distorted, then caught one final image. Carl Mercer's face in profile, lit by a work lamp, speaking to someone off camera. Mercer was in his late 50s, tall and silver-haired, with a narrow, handsome face that looked built for campaign dinners and funeral handshakes. His eyes were pale gray, clean and cold, the eyes of a man who had learned to imitate warmth without ever being troubled by it. Then the screen went black. Ryan's doubt did not vanish all at once. It cracked. "Miller Creek Warehouse," he said quietly. Sarah checked the weather alert on her phone, and the color left her face. "Ryan, Miller Creek is already over its banks." The deputy stepped toward the window, jaw tightening. "If the floor storage is real, and water gets in, anything left could be gone by noon." He grabbed his radio, but dispatch answered with bad news. 2 roads blocked by slides, 1 rescue unit tied up near the South Bridge, federal contacts at least an hour out. Ryan looked at Jack, and for 1 second the room held the bitter comedy of men who both knew the rules and both knew the storm had no respect for them. "We go look," Ryan said. "We do not play heroes." Jack looked down at Ranger. The German shepherd had turned from the door to the laptop, body rigid, as if Luke's voice had pulled him back through 3 lost years. "He already did," Jack said. The Miller Creek warehouse crouched at the edge of the flooded lowland like a guilty thing trying to sink before judgment arrived. It was an old timber and corrugated metal structure, half hidden behind sycamores and rusted fencing, with Carl Mercer Construction painted in faded blue letters across one wall. Water rushed around its foundation, brown and fast, carrying leaves, sticks, and pieces of broken fence. Jack parked on the highest patch of gravel, and Ryan stepped out first, one hand near his holster, the other raised against the rain. Sarah climbed out with a medical satchel and the sealed USB tucked inside a waterproof pouch. Ranger jumped down last, badly but determined, his injured leg buckling before he caught himself. The moment his paws touched the mud, his head snapped toward the warehouse. He did not search in circles. He moved straight for the side entrance. "That's not curiosity," Sarah whispered. Ryan drew a breath. "No, that's memory." Inside, the warehouse smelled of wet wood, oil, mold, and old secrets. Rain drummed on the metal roof. Water had begun sliding under the far wall, spreading across the floorboards in shining black sheets. Ranger moved ahead on leash, nose low, pulling with controlled force until he reached a section of floor near the back beside a stack of rotting pallets. He pawed once, then barked. Jack knelt and shone his flashlight. The boards were newer than the rest, cut clean, but stained to look old. "Trap below," he said. Ryan crouched beside him, suspicion gone now, replaced by the focused caution of a lawman who had just stepped onto history's buried knife. "We need tools," a voice behind them answered, smooth as polished stone. "No, deputy, you need to step away." Carl Mercer stood in the open doorway with rain silvering his expensive tan coat. On either side of him were 2 men. Travis Keene was a heavy-set man in his late 40s, thick-necked, with a shaved head, red cheeks, and hands scarred from years of logging work before debt made him loyal to Mercer. Owen Pike was younger, early 30s, narrow and restless, with a bony face, dark hair hanging wet over his forehead, and nervous eyes that kept darting to Ranger as though he feared the dog knew the weight of his sins. Mercer smiled at Sarah. "Dr. Collins, you always did have a talent for involving yourself in things that bite." Sarah's chin lifted. "Funny, I was thinking the same about you." Mercer's smile thinned. His gaze moved to Jack, then to Ranger, and for the first time something like fear touched the edges of his face. "That animal should have died in the fire," Ranger growled, low and thunderous. Ryan drew his weapon. "Carl Mercer, stay where you are." Travis raised a gas can in one hand. Owen held a road flare, unlit but ready. Mercer's voice hardened. "That drive disappears, this building burns, and everyone calls it flood damage." The next moments broke loose fast. Ranger lunged as Owen flicked the flare striker. Jack pulled Sarah behind a support post. Ryan moved to cover Mercer, but Travis kicked a weakened brace near the pallet stack. The water-swollen beam above them cracked and came down hard, knocking Ryan sideways and pinning his lower leg beneath a fallen timber. His gun skidded across the wet floor. Water surged through the gap in the wall, rising around the boards, swallowing the trapdoor seams. Ryan gritted his teeth but could not pull free. Jack saw it all in one clean, terrible frame. A man down, danger closing, seconds thinning into judgment. Once, long ago, seconds had become a cage. This time they became a door. Jack did not stop to measure every angle. He moved. He crossed the flooded floor, slammed his shoulder into Travis, and drove him back into a stack of crates. Ranger launched at Mercer, not for flesh but for cloth, jaws clamping onto the sleeve of Mercer's coat and yanking him off balance as the older man tried to reach Sarah's satchel. Sarah ran for the entrance, clutching the USB pouch to her chest, shouting into Ryan's radio for emergency backup, fire, rescue, anyone with a badge and a heartbeat. Owen dropped the flare into the water with a hiss and bolted into the rain. Jack reached Ryan, braced both boots against the floor, and lifted the timber with a sound torn from somewhere deeper than muscle. "Pull!" he barked. Ryan dragged his trapped leg free, face white with pain. Behind them, Mercer cursed, twisting against Ranger, but the old K-9 held on, wounded leg trembling, eyes blazing with 3 years of unfinished duty. Jack got Ryan upright as sirens finally began to wail faintly beyond the storm. He looked once at Ranger, at Sarah outside calling help, at Mercer struggling and failing to escape, and understood with a quietness almost holy, he had not outrun his past. He had simply chosen differently when the next moment came. The sirens reached the Miller Creek warehouse like the first trumpets of judgment, thin at first beneath the rain, then louder, nearer, until red and blue lights shattered across the wet walls and turned the floodwater into moving stained glass. Jack had Ryan's arm over his shoulder when the first deputies came through the broken doorway, their boots splashing across the rising water, their flashlights sweeping over the fallen beam, the open trap in the floor, Carl Mercer pinned by Ranger's jaws to a torn sleeve, and Sarah outside still speaking into the radio with the USB pouch clutched against her chest as if it were a newborn pulled from a burning house. Ranger did not let go until Ryan, pale with pain but still in command, said, "Release." The old German shepherd obeyed instantly. Carl Mercer stumbled backward into the hands of 2 deputies, his silver hair wet against his skull, his expensive tan coat ripped open at the arm, his polished face finally stripped of its Sunday donor smile. He tried to speak first, of course. Men like Carl always did. He said this was trespassing, hysteria, flood confusion, a misunderstanding caused by a damaged dog and a troubled veteran, but his voice had lost its velvet. It scratched now. It cracked at the edges. Jack watched him without satisfaction, because satisfaction would have been too small for what this night had uncovered. Ryan sat on an overturned crate while a paramedic wrapped his injured leg, but his eyes stayed fixed on the open floorboards. "Get floodlights in here," he ordered. "Photograph everything before it goes under." Within minutes, more help arrived. County deputies, fire rescue, and then 2 federal vehicles that had taken the long road around the washed-out bridge. The senior federal officer was Special Agent Grace Holloway, 46 years old, medium height, compact in build, with dark skin, close-cropped black hair, and eyes so calm they made loud men lower their voices without knowing why. She wore a navy rain jacket over a gray suit, no jewelry except a plain wedding band, and carried herself like someone who had spent years walking into rooms where lies had already taken their seats. Before joining federal service, she had investigated fraud against elderly homeowners after her own grandmother lost her house to a predatory land deal, and that wound had made her patient, precise, and merciless with men who hid cruelty beneath contracts. She listened to Ryan's brief report, took the USB from Sarah with gloved hands, then looked toward Ranger. "That's Luke Whitaker's dog?" she asked. Sarah answered before Jack could. Yes, and he brought Luke's last evidence back. Holloway did not smile, but something in her expression softened just enough to honor the impossible. "Then we treat him as part of the chain, not as a mascot." Under the lifted boards, search teams found a narrow underground storage space lined with plastic sheeting and cinder blocks. Floodwater had begun to seep in, but the main containers were still above the line. Inside were false ledgers, property transfer documents, cash payment records, restricted blasting caps, and crates of materials disguised beneath construction labels. There were folders marked with the names of older landowners across Cedar Ridge, each folder holding photographs, debt notes, intimidation letters, and draft sale agreements prepared before the owners had ever agreed to sell. Mary Whitaker's name sat in one of those folders, underlined twice in red ink. Luke's USB became the missing key. His video, his notes, and scanned copies of purchase records tied Carl Mercer to the warehouse before the explosion that killed him. By late afternoon, the rain finally weakened into a mist. Carl was taken away in cuffs, no longer a rich contractor with clean boots, but an old serpent dragged from beneath the floorboards. Travis Keene surrendered without fight, head bowed, his debt to Mercer suddenly looking heavier than loyalty. Owen Pike was found half a mile down the road, soaked and shaking behind a drainage culvert, more frightened of Ranger than of prison. Jack gave his statement once, plainly, with no decoration. Sarah gave hers with controlled fury. Ryan, despite the swelling in his leg, refused transport until every piece of evidence was catalogued. Ranger sat beside Jack through it all, exhausted but upright, his sable coat muddy, his injured hind leg trembling, his amber eyes moving from person to person as if confirming that the right hands had finally arrived. The next morning, Cedar Ridge woke to a strange quiet. The storm had passed, leaving trees split, fences down, and sunlight trembling over fields that looked rinsed by sorrow. At the sheriff's office, the briefing room smelled of coffee, damp uniforms, and paper fresh from the printer. Mary Whitaker arrived just before noon, leaning on a cane borrowed from the county clinic. She wore her son Luke's old brown marshal jacket over a blue dress, the sleeves too long for her thin arms, the collar brushed carefully as if she had spent half the morning speaking to it. Her white hair was braided neatly now, though a few wisps escaped around her lined face. She looked frail, but grief had not made her small. It had made her luminous in the terrible way old lanterns glow brightest in dark rooms. When Ryan, on crutches now, told her that Luke's case had been officially reopened and that the evidence proved her son had not been chasing shadows, Mary did not collapse, did not wail, did not make a scene for the local reporter standing too near the wall. She closed her eyes, inhaled once, and placed one trembling hand on Ranger's head. The dog leaned into her palm. "You brought him home," she whispered. "Didn't you, boy?" Ranger sat at her feet, silent and solemn, like an old knight who had returned a crown to its rightful altar. Agent Holloway explained that federal charges were being prepared and that Luke Whitaker's death would no longer be recorded as a tragic accident swallowed by fire. His work would be entered into the case record. His evidence would stand. His name would be cleared of the quiet doubt Carl had planted after the explosion. That was when Mary's face changed. Not into happiness. Happiness would have been too bright, too simple. It changed into peace, the kind that arrives late and sits carefully beside pain. A local news cameraman asked Jack to stand near Ranger for a photograph. Jack stepped back before the man finished the sentence. "No," he said. The reporter blinked, disappointed. "Mr. Miller, people will want to know what you did." Jack looked at Ranger, then at Mary. "Then tell them what he did." Sarah stood near the doorway, arms folded, watching him with a softness she did not try to hide. Later, in the hallway away from cameras and official voices, she checked Ranger's leg again and frowned at the tremor running through the old scar tissue. "He needs rest," she said quietly. "Real rest. Not a kennel, not a farm with broken fences and too many memories. He needs someone who understands that working dogs don't stop guarding just because the war is over." Jack knew what she was saying before she said it. Mary did too. The old woman looked down at Ranger for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rusted tag that had survived flood, fire, hunger, and 3 years of wandering. Love pulled one way, mercy pulled another. "I would keep him if I could," Mary said, her voice thin but steady. "But I can barely make it from the porch to the kitchen without arguing with my own knees." A small smile touched her mouth, sad and brave. Ranger looked from Mary to Jack, and in that glance there was no confusion, only the quiet trust of a soul that had already chosen its next post. Mary took Jack's hand and placed the old tag in his palm. "Luke brought him back to me," she said. "But maybe God brought him to you." A week later, Cedar Ridge gathered beneath a clean Tennessee sky, as if the storm had been only a dark sermon the mountains had finally finished preaching. The old Baptist church stood at the end of Maple Hollow Road, white-painted and weathered, with a steeple that leaned just enough to look humble rather than broken. Sunlight fell over the wet grass in golden sheets, touching the puddles left in the gravel lot and turning them bright as little mirrors of heaven. There was no stage, no television crew, no grand parade with polished speeches and flags snapping like commands. There were only folding chairs arranged beneath the church awning, a few veterans in faded caps, neighbors who had brought casseroles though no one had asked. Sarah Collins standing near the front with her auburn braid resting over one shoulder, Deputy Ryan Brooks leaning on one crutch with his injured leg wrapped, Mary Whitaker seated in the first row with Luke's old marshal jacket folded across her lap, and Jack Miller standing off to the side as if he had not yet decided whether he belonged among the living. Ranger stood beside him. The German shepherd looked different now, though not healed in the fairy tale way children imagine. His body was still lean, his hind legs still uneven, his muzzle still touched with gray, but Sarah had cleaned the mud from his sable coat, brushed out the burrs, treated the raw skin beneath his old collar, and fed him carefully enough that strength had begun to return like dawn through a cracked door. His amber eyes remained alert, but the terrible wilderness in them had softened. He no longer looked like a ghost that had walked out of the woods. He looked like a soldier who had finally been told the war was over. Pastor Eli Warren opened the small ceremony with a prayer. Eli was 68, tall but stooped in the shoulders, with warm brown skin, silver hair cropped close, and a voice worn smooth by decades of funerals, weddings, hospital rooms, and Sunday mornings when people came needing more than doctrine. He had once served as an army chaplain and still carried that quiet gift of speaking to both the broken-hearted and the stubborn without insulting either one. He did not make Ranger into a miracle too cheaply. He simply thanked God for loyalty that outlived fear, for truth that rose from floodwater, and for the strange mercy that sometimes arrived with muddy paws at a lonely man's door. Jack looked down when the prayer mentioned lonely men. Ranger leaned lightly against his leg as if to say the pastor had not lied, which was rude but fair. A few people chuckled softly when Jack gave the dog a sideways look. The sound eased something in the crowd. Even Mary smiled, though her eyes glistened. When Ryan stepped forward, his crutch clicked once against the church floorboards. He was not a man made for speeches, and the paper in his hand looked more dangerous to him than any storm. "We're here," he said, clearing his throat, "to recognize Ranger, formerly K-9 partner to Deputy Marshal Luke Whitaker, for preserving evidence, locating Mary Whitaker during the flood, and helping bring justice in a case this town should never have forgotten." His voice tightened at the end. He lowered the paper. Luke didn't die chasing shadows. Ranger proved that. And Jack Miller, whether he likes hearing it or not, made sure the proof got into the right hands. Jack's jaw shifted, but he did not look away. Sarah stepped forward next, holding a new leather collar in both hands. It was dark brown, simple, sturdy, the kind of thing built to last rather than shine. Attached to it was a small engraved plate that caught the sunlight. Ranger, Honorary K-9, never left behind. Sarah knelt in front of Ranger. Her green eyes softened as she let him smell the collar first. "You have caused me more paperwork than any patient I've had this year," she whispered, just loud enough for Jack to hear. "And that includes Mrs. Tally's goat, who ate 2 dish towels and half a Christmas wreath." Jack almost smiled. Ranger, being a gentleman and a decorated nuisance, stood still while Sarah fastened the new collar around his neck. The crowd did not cheer wildly. They applauded gently, with the reverence of people who understood they were not celebrating a trick, but honoring a promise kept across fire, hunger, flood, and 3 years of wandering. Mary rose slowly with Jack's help. She was small beside him, bird-boned and fragile, but her blue eyes were steady beneath the brim of her pale church hat. In her hands she held Ranger's old rusted tag, the one that had brought him back through the storm. "Ranger, return to M.W." "Luke gave him that," she said, her voice thin but clear enough to carry. "My son always believed Ranger understood more than people gave him credit for. He used to say, 'Mama, if I ever get lost, that dog will find the truth before any man finds his shoes.'" A ripple of soft laughter passed through the crowd, the kind that hurt and healed at the same time. Mary turned to Jack. "Luke would want him to spend what years he has left with someone who understands what it means to carry a battlefield in the heart." She pressed the old tag into Jack's palm. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was certain. "He came home to me," she said, looking down at Ranger, "but I believe God sent him on to you. Agent Grace Holloway had arranged the adoption papers through the proper federal channels, and she stood nearby with a folder in hand, professional as ever, though her eyes were kinder than they had been at the warehouse. Jack took the pen. For years, his hand had been steady under pressure and unsteady only in silence. This time, it did not shake. He signed his name. Jack Miller. Ranger Miller, Sarah joked under her breath, sounded like a dog who might run for mayor and win on the veterans' vote. Jack finally did smile then, small but real, and Mary laughed through tears. That evening, after the casseroles had been carried away, after Ryan had promised to visit Mary's farm twice a week until her porch steps were repaired, after Sarah had threatened Jack with professional violence if he overfed Ranger too quickly, Jack drove home with Ranger in the passenger seat. The storm was gone. The air smelled of wet pine, warm soil, and summer returning to itself. Crickets sang from the ditch grass. Moonlight silvered the dirt road to his cabin, making it look less like a road away from the world and more like a path back into it. Inside, Jack hung his coat by the door and placed Ranger's old tag on the small table beneath the turned photograph. He hesitated, then turned the frame back toward the room. Ben Carter's young grin looked out from the picture, bright and impossible, surrounded by men who had once believed they were too tough for ghosts. Jack touched the frame once. "I'm still here," he said quietly. It was not an apology, not anymore. It was a report. In the bedroom, Jack stopped at the hallway switch. For years, he had left that light burning because darkness had teeth, and memory knew how to bite. Tonight, Ranger walked past him, circled once at the foot of the bed, and lay down with his head on his front paws, eyes half open, guarding not because he had to, but because love had given him a new post. Jack left the hallway dark. He lay down and listened to Ranger's breathing, steady and warm in the room. The memory of Ben Carter did not vanish. It remained, but it no longer stood over him with a rifle made of guilt. It sat farther back, sorrowful but quiet. Among the other names a man learns to carry without letting them bury him. By morning, sunlight spilled across the porch. Mary arrived with Sarah and Ryan just after breakfast, bringing biscuits, bandage supplies, and a lemon pie that Ryan claimed was for Ranger's ceremony but somehow kept drifting toward his own fork. Ranger stepped onto the porch clean, brighter-eyed, his new collar shining against his fur. Jack stood beside him, looking at Mary in her son's jacket, Sarah with her doctor's bag, Ryan leaning on his crutch and pretending not to need it, and the mountains rising beyond them like old witnesses. For the first time in many years, the cabin did not feel like a hiding place. It felt like a home. And there they stood in the soft Tennessee morning. Jack, Mary, Sarah, Ryan, and Ranger, 5 souls gathered by storm, loss, courage, and grace. Ranger was no longer the missing K-9. Mary was no longer the mother left waiting in the ruins of an unanswered death. Jack was no longer a man trapped inside one frozen second. In a way none of them could fully explain. They had all been found. They had all been led back. No one was left behind. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder, trumpets, or a bright light from heaven. Sometimes they come quietly, soaked by rain, limping on wounded paws, carrying a rusted tag and a promise that refused to die. Ranger came to Jack's door in the middle of a storm, but maybe the storm was never only in the sky. Maybe God was using one faithful dog to lead a broken man back to courage, a grieving mother back to peace, and a forgotten truth back into the light. In our daily lives, we may not always understand why certain people, animals, or moments appear at our doorstep, but sometimes they are not accidents. Sometimes they are reminders from God that love still has work to do, that pain is not the end of the story, and that no soul is too lost to be found again. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment Amen if you believe God can send miracles in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, healing, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, comfort every wounded heart watching tonight, and remind you always that you are seen, you are loved, and you are never left behind.